I'm Nima Rajan. Canada's annual inflation rate hit a 30-year high of 4.8% last month, but economists warn that it could go even higher in the months ahead. Statistics Canada says the increase in consumer prices in December from a year earlier was driven by higher costs for food, passenger vehicles, and housing. It's the 9th straight month that headline inflation has come in above the Bank of Canada's target zone of between 1% and 3%. CIBC senior economist Andrew Grantham says it could grind even higher before cooling around springtime. Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux says the rationale for the government spending up to $100 billion to stimulate the economy no longer exists. Mr. Giroux says the federal guardrails designed to guide spending decisions appear to have been met. This suggests any stimulus should be wound down before the fiscal year ends in March. The government is projecting a better-than-expected deficit this year, but Mr. Giroux's report says the actual results may be worse than the $144.5 billion deficit outlined in December's budget. The Insurance Bureau of Canada says this year's floods in BC helped make 2021 Canada's 6th highest year in insured losses since 1983. The Bureau says insured damage from last year's extreme weather events totaled more than $2 billion. BC floods were the biggest ticket event at $515 million, followed closely by Calgary's $500 million hailstorm in July. 2016 remains the most expensive year on record at $5.4 billion in insured damage, due in large part to the Fort McMurray wildfires. Experts are warning that Canada's food security is facing threats from grocery store labor shortages, particularly in rural areas, as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to affect most industries nationwide. Gary Sands with the Canadian Federation of Independent Grocers says the number of workers calling in sick or in isolation has risen to an all-time high. He says grocers need to be prioritized for rapid testing kits, and if the labor situation continues to worsen, some stores won't be able to open. The readout of a call between Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and some of his key cabinet ministers and officials says they condemned Russia's military buildup in and around Ukraine. Last night's meeting also included a call for Russia to de-escalate the situation, uphold its international commitments, and find a peaceful solution through dialogue. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly has wrapped up her 2-day visit to Ukraine, and she says Canada has not decided if it would help to arm Ukraine's forces. The World Health Organization says the number of new coronavirus cases globally rose by 20% last week to more than 18 million. That marks a slowdown in the surge caused by the highly transmissible Omicron variant. The UN Health Agency reported that the number of new COVID-19 infections increased in every world region except for Africa. Meanwhile, as both Ontario and Quebec set new records for COVID-related hospitalizations, officials say the daily rate seems to be easing slightly. Health officials in Saskatchewan warn that the peak of the current wave in that province may still be weeks away. Statistics Canada says wholesale sales rose for a 4th straight month in November to $75.6 billion. The agency says sales were up 3.5% over the previous month, despite the impact of flooding and transportation disruptions in southern BC. It says 6 of the 7 subsectors saw gains, which were led by a 7.1% increase in sales of building materials and supplies, and a 5% jump in sales of miscellaneous products. Statistics Canada estimates the flooding caused a loss of about $600 million in wholesale sales. Ontario Premier Doug Ford launched a virtual housing summit this morning by promising more than $45 million to help cities speed up development approvals. Mr. Ford's government is creating a new fund to streamline development approvals and cut red tape. This so residential and industrial projects can get underway. The Premier says it will take the cooperation of all levels of government to tackle the housing crisis, and that he hopes the summit will produce concrete ways to allow more families to buy a home. Meanwhile, homeless shelters across the country are struggling with staff shortages due to the Omicron variant. This comes just as more and more people need their services. The executive director of Fredericton Homeless Shelters in New Brunswick says staff are also seeing more people dealing with addiction, as well as more complex and acute mental health issues. The Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness says it is hearing that frontline shelters and homeless agencies across the country are completely overwhelmed due to staffing shortages and a lack of funding. All right, we'll be right back with our weekly market update with Catherine Murray. So stay tuned, right back on Forum Daily News shortly. Welcome back. Up next, we take a look at the markets with Catherine Murray, the host of The Buck Stops Here. Take it away, Catherine.
Thanks, Nima. Hello, everyone, and welcome to your weekly market recap. I am Catherine Murray. Well, the downward market trend that we've seen in 2022 has continued into this week with the broad North American markets, the Dow, S&P, NASDAQ, Russell 2000, and of course the TSX all trading lower to start the week with quite a bit of pain pressure to the downside yesterday. Today, we are actually finding some signs of stabilization, and in fact, those indices are all now in positive territory. The negative sentiment, though, does continue to be driven by the upward yield environment. That U.S. 10-year yield has hit its highest level since 2020, so it's just trading above that 1.8% mark. And the market has been concerned that that would put downward pressure on the tech stocks and growth areas of the market, which is exactly what it's done. Basically, investors right now are repricing the U.S. Federal Reserve's hawkish policy stance, meaning that they are now expecting more rate hikes than previously thought. So again, there has to be an adjustment on the valuation front, and that's also why we're seeing the downward pressure on those specific areas of the market. But the other piece of negative news that came out this week is disturbing investors, which is the wage price pressures that the banks are actually starting to see. And that came out in their most recent earnings, sending some of the bank stocks down by 5%, 6%, 7%. So a bit of a surprise there in terms of how much increase they're seeing in wage prices for employees and pretty much across the board. So that's another added bearish mark to the market right now. Now, on the other side, you are seeing a number of strategists saying that the global growth outlook for 2022 is actually strong, and they do believe that the ability for stocks to withstand rate hikes is also fine and positive, and actually can be a good thing for stocks. And of course, there's more and more comments and views that we're seeing that Omicron might be peaking. So taken together, that would be the bullish case. But right now, it's definitely been more of a bearish start to the year. Now, in terms of market moves, with that in mind, you are seeing the defensive stocks really outperform. It was pretty interesting to see a down day in the market yesterday. And yet you had Kellogg as well as Altria, which is the U.S. owner of Philip Morris, ticker there is MO, both outperformed the market yesterday. So defensive seem to be a little bit in favor. Away from that, of course, we continue to keep our eye on the price of crude. WTI, it's up another 2% today. The energy sector has been on fire to start the year. It's up by about 15%. Interestingly, the IEA was out with a report saying that oil demand is resilient and that the supply continues to be constrained. Now, that is not new news for energy investors. People have really been involved in the energy sector, recognizing that there's been such a lack of capacity, production capacity, that is, over the past number of years, basically because of the vilification of the energy sector, to the point where now the market is really realizing that, to the extent that you actually have some strategists saying that we could see $100 oil. So be aware of that as it translates to expenses and also perhaps opportunities. In terms of earnings, that's front and center right now. We are in the second week of U.S. earnings. That will continue. We'll see an onslaught of earnings in the U.S. next week, as well as Canadian earnings will start to kick off. On that front, earnings front, that is, we did have some good results out of Bank of America as well as Morgan Stanley. Both of those stocks are up on their news, their results. And also Barrick, their preliminary full year production results sent that stock up by 6.5% today. Linamar, however, is trading lower to the tune of 7% to the downside. They provided an update on their end markets, saying that the markets are in line with their expectations, but they really are seeing the pricing pressures and constraints of labor shortages, as well as an increase in cost. So that stock, as I mentioned, is trading down. In terms of other things to be aware of in the marketplace, Canadian grocers are definitely discussing Trudeau's mandate for unvaccinated truckers not to be allowed into the Canadian borders, and or if they are, to quarantine. That shipments are in fact being constrained. They are seeing shortages. Keep in mind, inflation, food inflation, that is, December was up by 5.7%. That's just the overall number. Of course, certain areas within groceries are up much more than that. Lastly, I'll just end on mergers and acquisitions. Big news this week: Microsoft buying Activision's $70 billion deal. It's big news. It's important news in the sense that it indicates that companies are willing to put their cash to work and continue to grow their businesses by making acquisitions. So we'll hope that that does continue, because it's certainly a positive indicator in the market how CEOs feel about the outlook. Nima, I'll leave it there. Back to you.
Thanks for that, Catherine. That was Catherine Murray, the host of The Buck Stops Here. For more analysis and news on the markets, be sure to tune in to The Buck Stops Here, a very informative show. All right, we'll be right back after the break with a look at antivirals and vaccinations with Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director of Apple Tree Medical Group. As COVID-19 related hospitalizations continue their steady climb across the country, there is hope that Health Canada's approval Monday of Pfizer's antiviral COVID pill will help ease the health system strain. But health officials stress that it's not a replacement for vaccinations. Meanwhile, Canada's top doctor says the latest evidence does not show the Omicron variant is contagious for any less time than previous versions of the coronavirus. Chief Public Health Officer Dr. Theresa Tam says the sheer number of infections from Omicron is stressing workforces and has led every province and territory to follow American guidance and end isolation periods early. On Tuesday, Dr. Tam told MPs that the pandemic may end with an endemic form of the virus. Well, joining us now to tell us more about these latest developments is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Apple Tree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Always a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with Pfizer's new COVID-19 pill, Paxlovid. What do we know so far about it, Doctor?
Well, Paxlovid really contains two medicines, the nirmatrelvir and the ritonavir, both antivirals. Nirmatrelvir is a protease inhibitor, which means it works by blocking the viral replication in the early stages of the disease to really prevent progression to severe COVID-19. Ritonavir is really given with nirmatrelvir as a booster in many ways to help slow that metabolism and keep it in the body for longer periods of time with higher concentrations to combat the virus. So the medication is typically taken twice a day for 5 days. And some trials have shown that Paxlovid actually reduces the risk of hospitalization and death by 89% when medications are started within 3 days, beginning of symptoms, and up to 85% if started within 5 days.
Sounds very promising, Dr. Raut. So how does this pill compare to getting vaccinated when it comes to your immune response?
All right. So when we look at Pfizer specifically, the vaccine had a 91.3% efficacy against symptomatic COVID-19 infection. It was also found to be about 89% effective in preventing severe disease. Now, these numbers were relevant before Omicron, and what we understand is 2 shots may just not be enough with Omicron. So for Omicron, what we do know is a more robust protection is achieved by a 3rd dose. The booster gives you an antibody titer about 25-fold. And the third dose does provide a similar level of neutralizing antibodies to Omicron, as we saw those numbers from even before.
So what does this new pill mean for our continued fight against the virus?
I think it's an excellent addition to our arsenal against COVID-19. We do know that there are going to be issues. Dr. Theresa Tam has discussed that the supply of Paxlovid will be an early issue for sure, meaning likely the treatment is not going to be having much of an impact in the current Omicron wave. Canada has received about 30,000 courses already and 120,000 coming through after March.
Now, talking about Dr. Theresa Tam, she mentioned that Omicron is infectious for up to 10 days. So what does that mean for provinces that have shorter isolation requirements?
That's right. So very confusing area for sure. 3 weeks ago, the Center for Disease Control in the States cut down their period from 10 to 5. And it was based on a lot of evidence supporting that the infectious period may have been about 3 to 4 days. Public Health Agency of Canada still recommends that we go for 10 days, even after they test positive or symptoms begin. And there is evidence to support that as well. Unfortunately, every province and territory has stopped following that advice, starting with Ontario and Saskatchewan. Most provinces actually have reduced to 7 days, and a few others have reduced to 5 days there. So in Canada, those rules are set by the provinces and territories. And so really the provincial governments have the final say in isolation rates.
All right, Doctor, just about a minute left here, but Dr. Tam also said on Tuesday that the pandemic may end with an endemic form of the virus. So that sounds very interesting. What would an endemic form of the virus look like?
Right. So it certainly would look it would look complicated. I think what we're trying to see is whether that means mild disease. And the truth is it doesn't. An endemic disease does not mean a mild disease, and a mild disease does not mean an endemic disease. For instance, malaria killed more than 600,000 people in 2020, and it's considered an endemic disease. So overall, we still have a lot to go through. And I think when we see endemic, people will live with it, but not painlessly.
All right, Doctor, a quick 30 seconds left here, but what is your recommendation for Canadians who are afraid of catching this extremely infectious Omicron variant?
Right, so it's a confusing time with a lot of conflicting advice. So we should keep to basics, hand wash as much as you can, wear a mask as much as possible, follow the local isolation protocols, and if you haven't already, get your vaccinations and boosters.
Dr. Rout, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, we'll be right back with a look at news happening around the world as Russia insists that NATO stop expanding. That and more coming up next. A top Russian diplomat warned Wednesday that Moscow will accept nothing less but watertight U.S. guarantees precluding NATO's expansion to Ukraine. This even though the demand was rejected last week by the U.S. and its allies. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybkov, who led the Russian delegation at last week's security talks with the U.S., says Moscow has no intentions of invading Ukraine. But he emphasized that Russia wants legally binding guarantees from the West that NATO does not expand to Ukraine and other ex-Soviet nations. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron has told the European Parliament that the European Union must act quickly to draw up a new security plan on Ukraine. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Kyiv today as concerns grow that Russian President Vladimir Putin is planning an invasion. He plans to meet with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Geneva on Friday. Well, this comes as French-built fighter jets roared over the Acropolis as Greece races to modernize its military and flaunts new security alliances aimed at checking neighboring Turkey. 6 advanced Rafale jets purchased from the French Air Force flew in low formation over Athens on Wednesday. This was before their official handover to the Greek armed forces. NATO allies Greece and Turkey have long-standing disagreements over boundaries and oil and gas drilling rights in the eastern Mediterranean. It is a dispute that flared into a tense naval standoff in 2020. Major international airlines are taking widely different approaches to a dispute in the U.S. over concerns that new 5G mobile phone service could interfere with aircraft technology. Emirates has drastically reduced its U.S.-bound flights, while Air France said it would fly as normal. Some airlines said they received warnings from the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, or Boeing, that the 777 jet is particularly affected by the new service. U.S. President Joe Biden held a news conference today at the one-year mark of his presidency. He used the conference to call on the Federal Reserve to do more to fight inflation. This by pulling back on its monetary boosting of the U.S. economy. With inflation at nearly a 40-year high, public support for Mr. Biden and his administration has tumbled, even though economic growth and hiring has surged. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has defied calls to resign in a feisty performance in Parliament. But it may be too little to stop his Conservative Party's lawmakers who are trying to oust him over a string of lockdown-flouting government parties. Conservative legislators are judging whether to trigger a no-confidence vote in Mr. Johnson over the Partygate scandal, in which officials held boozy work parties while Britain was under a strict coronavirus lockdown. The Red Cross says 3 of Tonga's smaller islands have suffered serious damage from tsunami waves. This comes as a wider picture begins to emerge of the destruction caused by Saturday's eruption of a nearby undersea volcano. Communications have been down throughout the Pacific archipelago nation since the eruption. But a Red Cross ship made it to the outlying islands and reported back that few homes remain standing after settlements were hit with 15-meter-high waves. A snowstorm in the Middle East has left many Lebanese and Syrians scrambling to find ways to survive. The storm began on Tuesday night and is expected to peak on Thursday. In Lebanon, the economic collapse and currency crash have meant an increasing number of Lebanese families are not able to afford fuel to heat their homes this winter. Hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees in Lebanon and Jordan and others displaced by Syria's war are sheltering in poorly heated tents, relying mostly on layers of blankets to keep them warm. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has opened a new vaccine manufacturing facility. He says it will boost the country's capacity to make its own inoculations for diseases, including COVID-19. Mr. Ramaphosa said the plant in Cape Town will help improve Africa's ability to produce vaccines. South African media report that the company has invested about $200 million to start the facility. Amazon has announced the full title of a new saga. It is set thousands of years before the events of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit novels. The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, is set to debut on September 2nd, with episodes to be released weekly. The series is filmed in New Zealand, and the producers say it will unite all the major stories of Middle-earth's Second Age. This includes the making of the rings, the rise of the Dark Lord Sauron, the tale of Numenor, and the last alliance of elves and men. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.